In this video, I'm going to demonstrate from start to finish how I edit photographs in Lightroom. The picture you see on the screen is actually a finished picture. This is one that I've edited earlier, and I'm going to show you from start to finish how I got to this point. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to take the photograph that I've got edited here and make a virtual copy of it. Virtual copies is something that Lightroom allows you to do so that you can make multiple versions of a single picture from one raw file. In order to make a virtual copy, you find the picture that you want to do this with in your list of pictures here, right click it, and choose Create Virtual Copy. And you'll see it says Virtual Copy 1 created. Now when you put your mouse over the original version, it'll say 1 of 2, and then over the copy it says 2 of 2. And what we're going to do, I'm going to reset all the settings back to the default so that we can start from scratch right from the very beginning. And in order to do that, I will right click the copy, go to Develop Settings, and Reset. And now we have the original picture back. This is the default settings from Lightroom gave me this version. So this is what I started with before I did all the editing that got the version we saw at the very beginning. Now the first thing we need to do is actually found at the very bottom of the different palettes here with all the Lightroom controls. You can see here where it says Profile, Adobe Standard. With many cameras there's actually other profiles you can choose. I shoot with a Canon 5D Mark II, and with the Canon 5D Mark II in Lightroom you have the choice of Adobe Standard, which is the normal process Adobe would, as far as the normal way of rendering color that Adobe thinks is correct. But then you can also choose Camera Faithful, which tends to give a lower contrast version with a little bit more muted color. Camera Landscape. The landscape version tends to give very deep saturated blues, and it also emphasizes the reds and yellows. So it's good for things like landscapes with blue skies and sometimes things with flowers. I actually don't like how it renders green grass or green plants, interestingly enough, but for pictures like this that don't have very much green, I like what it does to the sky. It gives a really incredible sky color, I think. That's the version we're going to end up using, but I'll go ahead and show you the others. Camera Neutral is similar to the Camera Faithful. It's a low contrast, more natural color saturation version, and then Camera Portrait is supposed to give better skin tones. Most of the time when I shoot portraits I actually end up using the Adobe version instead, because the Camera Portrait I think gives skin tones that are too pink, too red. That's just my opinion though. And then Camera Standard gives a little bit more color saturation, a little bit more contrast than the Camera Faithful and Camera Neutral. But it's not quite as much as the it's a little bit different than the Adobe Standard. It tends to have a little bit less contrast. In the color rendering, I think that the Camera Standard version renders reds a little bit more accurately than the Adobe Standard. Other than that, and the contrast difference, there's not a whole lot between them. Now I'm going to use Camera Landscape for this because I really want that sky. And you can see that gives this really deep blue sky, and it's also emphasized the red on the sign here and the yellow in the railroad cars. Now the next thing we need to do is lens corrections. And if you go up here, click the Profile tab, if you click Enable Profile Corrections, it detects what lens that I had on the camera, which was the Canon 24 to 105 millimeter f4L lens. And it automatically loads. Adobe has profiles for a lot of different lenses by the major camera companies and also some of the third-party lens manufacturers. And so when you do this, it automatically gives you what it thinks is the amount of distortion correction and the amount of vignetting correction. In other words, correction for the corners of the picture going too dark. And it's actually able to detect what focal length you had a zoom set to, and can set itself accordingly, because zoom lenses at different zoom settings will have different amounts of vignetting or different amounts and different types of distortion. And I think this does a really great job of getting rid of distortion, but I tend to, at least with this lens, I tend to like the vignetting to stay in there because it gives the edges of the picture a little bit darker feel, which kind of leads the eye into the center of the picture. And so in many cases I end up turning the vignetting down to 0 because you can adjust how much vignetting correction it gives, and you can adjust how much distortion correcting it gives also, but I tend to leave that alone. I think it does a very good job with that. Now the next thing that we check is remove chromatic aberration. You should always check this. Almost every lens has some of it, and this does a good job of getting rid of most of it. If you just click the box, with most subjects and most lenses, I found that that's good enough. Now sometimes I have to increase the amount of defringing on the purple or the green hue versions. This picture here really doesn't need it. I looked at it. You tend to see this around tree branches, and I don't see really, there's a little bit of chromatic aberration around these. Let's go ahead and turn this up. Most of the time I end up putting the purple one up by 2 with this lens. I think that's improved it a little bit. I'll go ahead and leave it as is. The next thing that we can do is the manual lens corrections. And what this lets you do is this lets you do things like rotating the picture. Let's say you handheld the camera and you didn't get your horizon perfectly straight. You can use rotation to fix that. That's actually an issue with this picture. This overpass that I photographed says "Welcome to downtown," and the city I live in is a city of 250,000 people, and this road, Lafayette Street, is actually one of the busiest roads in the city. In order to get it like this where cars weren't zooming past me, I had to wait for a stoplight about 2 blocks behind where I was standing to stop the cars, and I would run out there and snap the picture in the few seconds I had before other cars started turning onto the road or till the light turned green, and then I'd jump back over the guardrails there and wait on the sidewalk till the cars went past. And I had a heck of a time getting the picture with the horizon straight. I kept having it crooked, so I had to do this over and over, jump out in the street, snap a few, jump back to the sidewalk, chimp the pictures on the LCD screen, realize I screwed up, and then try again. And this one here is the best one of all of them, and it's not perfect. It's rotated a little bit, but usually I use a tripod with a level and I get this stuff perfect. But in a situation like this, it just wasn't possible to stand in the middle of one of the busiest streets in a big city and get myself run over to use a tripod. So I had to make do with what I had. And so, in addition to rotation, you can also, there's corrections for vertical and horizontal, which those are for, let's say you photograph a building and you have to point the camera a little bit upwards to see the entire building. It corrects the keystoning, where the top of the building is narrower than the bottom. You can correct in Lightroom for those distortions that are caused by having the camera tilted upward to see the top of a building. And I do that with a lot of my architectural work. I think this is just awesome. When I was shooting film and doing printing in the darkroom, you basically were stuck with what you got, which is why people shot a lot of that kind of work with view cameras that have the ability to to tilt or rotate the lens to correct for it. But when you're shooting 35mm or a medium format film, which is what I'd always shot with, that wasn't possible. And even though I still shoot film today, I scan my negatives and I can do the same work on scanned negatives as well. This picture here needs, to begin with, we need to rotate it a little bit, because as you see, when you put your mouse over the sliders here, a grid appears, and that grid will let you see if any corrections are needed. And actually it's very, very close as is. Most people probably wouldn't even notice if we left it alone, but I'm going to, oops, that's way too much. Let's dial this back a bit. What I ended up using was plus 0.1, so I'll just go ahead and type it in myself. And you can see here that the grid line right along the bottom of the edge of the overpass there, now it's perfect. And that also applies to all the other lines in the picture too. They're all tracking pretty closely, so I think that looks pretty good the way it is. This picture I don't think really needs any correction for vertical or horizontal distortion, because the camera was pretty level since this was looking down a hill. I didn't have to point the camera upward. So I'm going to leave everything else alone. Now, one thing we're going to have to do, if you look in the corners here, you can see down here there's a little bit of a white sliver in the corner. And that's caused by having rotated the image. We need to crop it a little bit to get rid of that. And there's actually one of those in every corner of the picture. So we'll go ahead and do that. You click on the cropping tool up here. Just pull each of the four sides in a bit to get rid of that. Hit OK. Now, this picture here I actually cropped a little bit more in the final version because I wanted to get rid of... I didn't like this tree crowding right up against the edge here, and the same with the one on this side. So now that we've done the cropping necessary to get rid of our artifacts from the rotation, let's go ahead and do cropping for creative effect. I can't remember if that's the amount of cropping I did on the original, but it looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and stick with this. Now let's go on up here to where we can affect things like contrast and exposure, white balance. What you get as a default is what the camera set with its auto white balance feature. And this is okay, but I feel like it's a little bit too cool. Especially in these shadowed areas, they've gone really blue, but we can't really get rid of all that because if we warmed it up enough to fix that, our lighted areas would be very yellow and red. But I think that these areas too could go just a little bit warmer because it was a very bright, yellow sun, warm lighting day in these brightly lit areas. There's several ways you can set white balance. There's presets you can choose. There's as shot, which is what the camera gives you. Auto lets Lightroom do its thing, which in this case didn't do a very good job. It's way too yellow. Some pictures this works well for though, so I always try it. There's presets for daylight, which is actually a lot better. It's maybe a little too warm, but it's not nearly as bad as the auto. And then cloudy, which is going to be way too warm for this. Shade, tungsten, fluorescent, flash, and then custom is what you get if you adjust the white balance sliders yourself. Let's go back on up here to daylight. There's one other thing you can do too, and that's the eyedropper. If you take the eyedropper and you click on something that's either white or neutral colored, like a gray, we'll do that with the gray on the side of the railroad car here. It does white balancing based on that. Now in this case I think it's gone too cool because this area here really should be warmer because of the way the light looked. But the computer doesn't know that. It just takes the gray tone and tries to neutralize it, make it neutral gray. You can also do it based on something that's white, like our snow. Snow is actually usually a little bit bluer looking than what our eyes register as far as actual measurements of its color. And because of that, it's warmed the picture up quite a bit. Let's compare this to the as shot and see how it is. It's a little bit warmer than the as shot version. And I think I like that. I think it might be just a little bit green though. Let me adjust the magenta here up just a bit. That warms it up a little bit. Yeah, let's leave it at that. Now the next choice we have, there's exposure, there's contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. If you move the exposure one, this kind of lightens and darkens the whole, or lightens and darkens pretty much all the tones in the picture, with especially a lot of influence on the midtones and light areas. You can see as we go up, the midtones seem to be affected more than the dark areas, and the white areas really rapidly lose detail. I'm not going to mess with that. I'm going to leave that at 0. The contrast I usually don't find myself messing with either. Highlights and shadows are a lot more useful. If you move the highlight one down, that darkens the highlight tones, darkens the light tones. It's useful for things like real bright snow to give you a little extra detail on them. As you can see what happened here when I've pulled it down, those footprints and such in here become a little more distinct. I try not to overuse this, so if you really overuse this a lot, it kind of muddies the midtones a little bit when you pull it down too far. And it can even make the light tones look a little bit muddy too if you pull it down far enough. I'm going to set this at 0 for right now, because a bigger concern to me is the shadows. This dark area here is really way too dark. It's a lot darker than it was in real life. And this is really an artifact of the camera's sensor. It just doesn't have the dynamic range to capture these very brightly sunlit areas and these very dark areas at the same time. If this hadn't been a situation where I was standing in the middle of a busy street about to get run over, I would have used a tripod and shot the picture twice. One with the exposure set for the light areas and once with the exposure set for the dark areas. And I would have combined parts of the two pictures to get an image that was visually pleasing, where everything had good detail. I didn't have that luxury here though. Didn't want to die today, so I just shot one picture. But we can still fix this. If we use the shadow slider here, if you raise that up, you start getting more detail in these darks. It lightens them up. Now there is a penalty to pay for doing this. If you look at the very darkest areas, like in here, magnified 100%, you can see a lot of noise in there, and that's because there wasn't sufficient exposure to keep detail in these areas. But if we don't, we couldn't have exposed any more, because if we did, we would have lost our light tones. And it's actually easier to recover dark tones that are underexposed than it is to recover light tones that are overexposed. That's why when we shoot digital, we expose to make the light tones look the best, and then we work with the shadow tones as we can. Now there's a couple ways to get around this. One is there's noise reduction we can use. And before we get on to that though, take a note of what's happened to the other tones in the picture. When you raise the shadows, it does raise the midtones and the light areas a little bit that need to be compensated for. If I've done a really large shadow adjustment like this, and adding 72 is a very big adjustment, I'll pull the exposure down a little bit to get our midtones and light tones back where they ought to be. And this is only 0.25 stop, so it's not a lot of exposure reduction, but it gets our highlights back where they need to be and gets the midtones back to a normal level. I'm going to pull down the highlights a little bit too to make sure we get the detail in these white areas in the snow aren't lost. Now let's go down to the sharpening and noise reduction settings. And we should view it at 100% when we do this. Now, if we look at it magnified like this, we see that noise is not an issue in the midtones and the light tones, but it is in these dark tones. And if we raise the noise reduction up to about 20, we can see the noise is starting to soften out here. Lightroom is slow with their noise reduction. When I pulled the slider up, I had to wait a few seconds for the actual adjustment to show on screen. Now when we've done this, we've reduced the noise quite a bit, but we've also lost sharpness in these lighter areas. And so we compensate for that by adjusting our sharpening. And as I said in the other video I've done on how to use sharpening, the radius is defaulted at 1 in Lightroom for sharpening, but you really should use a lower one for something that has a lot of fine detail like this. I'm going to reduce this down to 0.5, and then I'm going to raise the detail up to about 50, and I'm going to raise the amount to about 50 and see what we get. I'm going to keep raising it up. Now we can see the detail starting to come back up here. This is starting to look a lot sharper now. You can see the texture and the detail and all this stuff. The sign here is starting to get a sharp detail back around the edges of it. And if we want to see what it would look like without the sharpening, we can turn that off. Next to where it says detail here, there's this little box. If you click it like this, it turns the sharpening off. You can see how unsharp that becomes. Turn it back on, and sharpness returns. I think I may have gone a little bit too high with this because you can see there's some weird artifacts around this curve right here. I'm going to try reducing the amount a bit. There's still a little bit, and I think that a lot of that is because of the interaction between the shape of that curve and the grid of pixels on the sensor. It's basically a moire effect, so some of these are things you're going to be stuck with. And most of the time this print's not going to be printed big enough where that would actually be noticeable. If we look back in here in our dark areas, there's a little bit of noise still, but it's not really, really bad. In most prints, most people would never notice it. Now here's something else we can try. These other sliders up here that say whites and blacks, these are like using the levels command in Photoshop where you can brighten the whites or darken the blacks by pulling in the edges of the histogram. I usually leave these alone. Most pictures really you don't want to do this because they're kind of a heavy-handed adjustment. If you adjust the blacks, you're actually forcing black tones off to the side of the exposure range where they go to pure black. I thought by bringing this down a little bit we could reduce some of the detail in here to cover that noise up. But I'm thinking, yeah, maybe just a little bit. That's it. I think this is about finished. Now what I would do with this after I get done with it in Lightroom, most pictures need a little bit of dodging and burning in other work in Photoshop. And so what I would do now is I would export the picture out of Lightroom, and then I would export it as a PSD file, the Photoshop photo format, and then I would open it in Photoshop and do any dodging and burning using adjustment layers, which I have a video online and also a written tutorial on crawfordphotoschool.com showing how to do that. And there's several things I can see here that I would want to work on, like this little spot right here in the snow is a little bit too bright. It's distracting. I'd burn that down a little bit. There's a few other little things. It's not a lot of big stuff. Maybe I might darken down this little bit of the sign here. Just a little nitpicky stuff. Most people might not even notice, but I'm a perfectionist. I've been known to sit at this computer screen and stare at a picture for hours messing around with it, and sometimes I go too far and scrap it all and start again because I'm just that obsessive. If you're not obsessive compulsive about your pictures the way I am, you could say, hey, this is done, export the file to keep in your archives, and put it online, make prints, whatever you want to do with it. Let me show you how I organize pictures in here. I don't use Lightroom to organize my pictures. If you're someone who has as much work as I do, Lightroom really is not a good way of organizing your pictures. It's not a good asset management system, because if you have too much stuff in here, I mean, I have tens of thousands of photographs, it gets pretty slow. So I use it only as a raw conversion in basic editing software. And so the way I do this is I have a folder on my desktop called Digital Unfinished. So whenever I shoot any new digital stuff, I create a folder that's named with the subject matter and the date, which this one is Fort Wayne 1/13/14. Inside that folder, I create another folder called Raw. All the raw files from the camera get imported into that folder. I copy them off the memory card and into the raw folder. I create also a folder called Unfinished, and what I use this for is after I've worked on something in Lightroom, I put all the raw files in here, I import them into Lightroom, but I tell Lightroom to leave them in their original location. They're just being, Lightroom can edit them, but they're not actually being copied into Lightroom's database. And so once I got them in Lightroom, I can go through, choose the ones I want to edit, do the editing work, And then once I get the editing done, then I export them to the unfinished folder. And inside the unfinished folder are ones that I'm from the shoot that I'm working on. When I get each one of them finished, then I will save it to another folder called just done within the same overall folder for the project. And the reason for that is that typically I will not finish every picture that I edited in Lightroom. A lot of times I'll have several different versions of a picture, or I might have several photographs from a certain subject that I'll edit them in Lightroom, and then I'll spend some time, thinking about them, looking at them on the screen, deciding if I really like them. And typically what happens is I might have, I might put a number of pictures in the unfinished folder that I've edited in Lightroom. But as I live with them for a little while, I'll decide some of them really aren't that great, or they're not as good as another one that I had in the folder that's similar. And so only some of them get the final editing in Photoshop, which puts them into the done folder. And so I don't delete the ones that I don't finish, though. I go ahead and leave them in the unfinished folder since I've already edited them in Lightroom and everything. And that's because there have been times I've gone back to old projects and looked in the unfinished folder, and I said, hey, why didn't I finish that one? That's actually a good picture. So I'll pull it out and start working on it again. So I never delete anything. Hard drive space is cheap, so you might as well keep everything. Something else that I do with the ones that go into the done folder is that as part of my editing in Photoshop, I also open up Photoshop's file info, and I type in lists of keywords and descriptions and stuff like that for the picture. Now you can do that in Lightroom too. If you don't have Photoshop and you're using Lightroom for all your editing, you can also do that in Photoshop or in Lightroom. Lightroom has the ability for you to put in keywords and such. But I do that in Photoshop since that's where I do my final editing anyway. But that's the steps I did from start to finish to work on this picture. This is a pretty straightforward one, but it did require a lot of editing to get this detail back in these dark areas. And that's something that Lightroom really excels at, is the ability to bring in detail in light and dark areas from pictures that were shot in very high contrast situations like this. And you can do the same thing with Photoshop. If you don't have Lightroom and you're going to edit your raw files in Photoshop, everything I've shown you in here in Lightroom, it works the same in Photoshop. If you have the latest edition of Photoshop, because I think I've got Photoshop 5, which is not the latest one, of course, and the controls are not quite the same in Photoshop 5. They changed them in this version of Lightroom, which is newer. So if you're shooting with Photoshop, with Photoshop's the digital subscription version, the Creative Cloud, then you'll have an interface in Photoshop's Camera Raw that looks very much like what we've worked with on here, and the controls do the same thing.